I noticed it before my son did, which I'm grateful for, even now, more than a year later. I was setting his plate down at my in-laws' dining table, this past Christmas, when I saw it clearly. Every other grandchild's plate held a beautifully cooked filet, the special $120 steaks my father-in-law had bragged about pre-ordering from his favorite butcher weeks in advance. My son Eli's plate held a hot dog. I froze for half a second, doing the math my mind didn't want to complete. 6 grandchildren at that table, 5 steaks, 1 hot dog, for the only one who wasn't my husband's parents' biological grandchild. I want you to understand, before anything else, that I composed my face immediately, smiled at my 6-year-old son, and said, brightly, "Ooh, hot dogs, your favorite." Because whatever I was feeling in that moment, whatever quiet, cold fury was beginning to build in my chest, my son did not need to be the one who carried it. He was 6. He deserved, at minimum, to enjoy his dinner without understanding, in that exact moment, that he'd just been quietly, deliberately marked as less than his cousins. I want to tell you how I got from that dining room table to, 2 weeks later, a conversation that changed my family's relationship with my in-laws permanently. My name is Monica. My son Eli is from my first marriage, which ended when he was 2, amicably enough that his father remains actively involved in his life, sharing custody in a way that's worked well for everyone involved. I met my husband, Marcus, when Eli was 3, and Marcus has been, in every meaningful sense, a genuine, loving stepfather to him ever since. Present at school events, patient through tantrums, the kind of steady, consistent presence I'd always hoped Eli would have. Marcus's parents, David and Susan, welcomed me warmly enough when Marcus and I first got together, 4 years ago. They've never been outright cruel to Eli, not in any way I could point to directly, not for years. What I noticed instead, gradually, was something quieter and harder to name, a specific, consistent pattern of small distinctions between Eli and his cousins, Marcus's brother's 2 biological children, that I'd spent years telling myself were probably just my imagination, or oversensitivity, or the natural result of Eli simply seeing his grandparents less often than his cousins did. The Christmas card, every year, addressed to David, Susan, and the grandchildren, with a photo insert that somehow, every single year, only included the biological cousins, never Eli. The birthday gifts that were noticeably more generous for the other kids, thoughtful, personalized presents for his cousins, generic gift cards for Eli. The way Susan, more than once, had introduced Eli to new acquaintances as Marcus's stepson, with a specific emphasis on that word that I'd always told myself I was probably reading too much into. I brought my concerns to Marcus, carefully, more than once over the years, and I want to be honest, he didn't always see it as clearly as I did, at first. Not because he didn't love Eli, he does, completely, without reservation, but because he'd grown up inside his parents' particular way of relating to family, and some patterns are harder to see clearly from inside them than they are from outside. "I think you might be reading into some of this," he told me, gently, about 2 years into our marriage, after I'd pointed out the Christmas card pattern for the 3rd year running. "My parents love Eli. I really don't think they're doing this on purpose. I'm not saying it's some grand conspiracy, Marcus. I'm saying there's a pattern, and I think it matters, even if nobody's consciously deciding to hurt him." He listened, and over the following 2 years, I noticed him starting to pay closer attention himself, gently correcting his mother when she referred to the grandchildren, in ways that seemed to exclude Eli, making sure Eli's gifts were as thoughtful as his cousins on the occasions when he was directly involved in the gift-giving. It helped, some. It didn't fully solve the underlying pattern, which continued to surface in smaller, harder to address ways, right up until the steak dinner made it, for the first time, completely undeniable. The Christmas dinner itself had been planned for weeks, David's excitement about the pre-ordered steaks a running theme in the family group chat throughout December. Specific cuts, specific preparation methods, a level of culinary enthusiasm I hadn't seen from my father-in-law about any previous family gathering. He'd mentioned, more than once, how much the grandchildren were going to love getting the good stuff this year, a specific, expensive treat meant to make the holiday memorable for all of them. I remember feeling genuinely warm about it. Walking into their house that evening, Eli practically vibrating with excitement about seeing his cousins, completely unaware of anything except the ordinary, uncomplicated joy of a family holiday. It was only once we were seated, plates being distributed by David himself with visible pride, that I understood exactly what all of them had actually meant. 5 beautifully prepared fillets, one for each of Marcus's brother's 2 children and, oddly, one extra that I later understood had been meant as a backup in case anyone wanted seconds. And Eli's plate, set down by David without any apparent hesitation or discomfort, holding a single, plain hot dog, the kind of kid's meal you'd offer a toddler who couldn't handle steak, not a 6-year-old perfectly capable of eating whatever his cousins were eating. I want to describe what happened in the next several seconds, because I think the specific, small details matter. I looked at Marcus, whose face had gone through a rapid, visible shift from holiday warmth to something sharper, more alarmed, as he clearly registered the same thing I had. I looked at David, who was already moving on to serve the next plate, seemingly entirely unaware that he'd just done anything worth noticing. I looked at Eli, who was looking at his cousin's steaks with the simple, unguarded curiosity of a 6-year-old encountering something new, not yet understanding the significance of the difference, not yet old enough to fully process why his plate looked different from everyone else's at the table. "Ooh, hot dogs, your favorite," I said, my voice bright, steady, giving nothing away, reaching over to cut it into smaller pieces the way I always did, keeping my hands remarkably calm even as something cold and clear was beginning to settle into my chest. Eli, satisfied, dug in happily, entirely unbothered, exactly the way 6-year-olds usually are about whatever's directly in front of them. I looked at Marcus, across the table, and saw my own quiet, controlled fury reflected back at me in his eyes. Neither of us said anything at that dinner table, but I want you to know, clearly, that the 2 weeks that followed were not going to leave that steak dinner unaddressed. We didn't say anything at dinner. We didn't say anything in the car on the way home, either, both of us quiet, Eli chattering happily in the back seat about the presents he'd gotten, entirely oblivious to the tension sitting silently between his parents in the front seat. It was only after Eli was asleep that night, both of us sitting at our own kitchen table, that Marcus finally spoke. "I need to say something, and I need you to know I mean it completely," he said, his voice carrying a rawness I hadn't heard from him in years. "I've spent 2 years telling myself you were reading into things that probably weren't intentional. Tonight, I watched my father hand my son a hot dog while every other grandchild at that table got a $120 steak, and I can't explain that away anymore. I can't, and I'm furious that it took something this blatant for me to finally stop making excuses for my own parents. I need you to hear something too," I said, keeping my voice steady, though the exhaustion of years of quietly noticing this pattern alone was finally catching up with me. I'd been managing this by myself for 2 years, Marcus. Noticing it, absorbing it, deciding each time whether it was worth bringing up, worth risking conflict with your parents over. I can't keep being the only one holding this. I need you fully in this with me, starting tonight. "I am," he said, "completely. I don't know exactly what we do about it yet, but I'm not going to sit at another dinner and watch my son treated like an afterthought while I stay quiet to keep the peace with my parents." We spent that week talking through what had happened, and more importantly, talking through the pattern underneath it, years of small distinctions I'd noticed, that Marcus, once he started actively looking, began noticing too, in memories he'd previously explained away without much scrutiny. "I think I understand it now," Marcus told me, a few days later, working through it slowly, painfully. "I think my parents have never fully accepted Eli as a real grandchild, not the way they accept my brother's kids. I think they've been polite about it, superficially warm, but underneath that politeness, there's always been this quiet distinction, the biological grandkids, and then Eli, who gets included in the group photo captions but somehow still ends up with a hot dog while everyone else gets steak. I've thought that for 2 years," I said. "I just didn't have a moment as clear as tonight to finally say it out loud without it sounding like I was overreacting to something small." "It's not small," Marcus said. "I don't think I fully understood how not small it was until I watched it happen with my own eyes. At my own parents' table, to my own son. I want to be honest about the guilt that surfaced in me during that week, too, a specific, complicated guilt about how long I'd let this pattern continue, quietly absorbing it, deciding, over and over, that each individual instance wasn't quite significant enough to disrupt the relative peace of our extended family relationships. I should have said something years ago, I told Marcus, one evening, sitting with that guilt openly for the first time. The Christmas card thing, the gift disparities. I noticed all of it, and I kept deciding it wasn't worth the conflict. You're not the one who should be apologizing here, Marcus said firmly. My parents are the ones who've spent years treating my son like a lesser grandchild, and I'm the one who should have been paying closer attention from the beginning, instead of needing something this obvious to finally take it seriously. I'm not going to let you carry guilt over something my own family did. I appreciated that, genuinely, though I still sat with my own version of regret in the days that followed, the specific, familiar regret of a parent who realizes, in hindsight, that she let her child quietly absorb a pattern of exclusion for longer than she should have, out of a desire to keep family relationships smooth rather than risk the discomfort of naming it clearly. We didn't confront David and Susan immediately, and I want to explain why. Because I think the choice matters. Marcus and I spent that first week almost entirely focused on Eli, watching him carefully, without making him feel scrutinized, to understand whether the hot dog dinner had actually registered as significant to him, or whether, as it had appeared at the table, he'd genuinely been unbothered by it, focused instead on the ordinary joy of a holiday with his cousins. It seemed, thankfully, that it hadn't landed as a wound for him directly. 6-year-olds, we learned, mostly notice what's directly in front of them, and a hot dog, to Eli, was simply a hot dog, not yet a symbol of anything larger. That understanding shaped how Marcus and I decided to handle the confrontation that followed, not as a dramatic, immediate blow-up at the dinner table itself, which risked Eli overhearing and understanding, for the first time, exactly what had happened, but as a careful, deliberate conversation, held separately. Once we'd had time to think clearly about what we actually wanted to say and what changes we actually wanted going forward. I don't want this to become something Eli has to carry consciously, I told Marcus, during that first week. I want us to protect him from fully understanding what happened, while also making absolutely sure it never happens again. Agreed, Marcus said, which means we need to have this conversation with my parents directly, clearly, away from any family gathering, so we can actually be heard instead of managing everyone else's reactions in the moment. We scheduled a conversation with David and Susan for the following weekend, just the four of us, at a coffee shop rather than either of our homes. Neutral ground, Marcus's suggestion, a place where the conversation could stay focused and calm rather than escalating into the kind of emotional family drama that tends to happen in more familiar, charged spaces. We need to talk about Christmas, Marcus said, once we were all seated, his voice steady in a way that told me he'd spent real time preparing for this moment. Specifically, about Eli's plate. David's face shifted immediately into something defensive. Is this about the hot dog? Marcus, I genuinely didn't think anything of it. I figured Eli might not be as adventurous an eater as the older kids, so I made sure he had something I knew he'd enjoy. Eli's 6, Dad. He eats what everyone else eats. He's had steak before, plenty of times. This wasn't about his palate. Susan spoke up then, her voice carrying the same careful, defensive tone I'd heard from her before, whenever the subject of Eli's place in the family came up even glancingly. I really think you're reading too much into a simple dinner choice. We love Eli. Nobody's trying to make him feel excluded. I need you both to actually hear what I'm about to say, without immediately defending yourselves, Marcus said, and I watched something in his posture settle into a firmness I hadn't seen him direct at his own parents before, ever, in the 4 years I'd known him. This isn't about one dinner. It's about a pattern I've been slow to see clearly, and I need to name it honestly now that I finally do. He laid it out methodically, the Christmas card photo insert, year after year, that somehow never included Eli. The gift disparities. The specific, casual way Susan sometimes introduced Eli as, my stepson, rather than simply, my grandson, a distinction that carried weight even when unintentional. And finally, the steak dinner itself, the clearest, most undeniable instance in a pattern that had been building quietly for years. I don't think either of you wake up in the morning intending to hurt a 6-year-old, Marcus continued. I actually believe that. But intention doesn't change what Eli's experience of this family has been, gradually, over years, and I'm not willing to keep explaining it away the way I have been, just because naming it clearly makes for an uncomfortable conversation. David's face had gone through several shifts by then. Defensiveness, then something more uncertain, the specific discomfort of a man confronted with a pattern he'd never consciously examined. I don't know what to say, Marcus. I never thought about it that way. Eli's your family, so he's our family too. I never meant for any of this to add up to something that felt like rejection. I believe that you didn't mean it consciously, I said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. But David, Susan, I need you to understand something directly, from me, as Eli's mother. He is not a lesser grandchild because his biology is different from your other grandkids. He is Marcus's son in every way that matters, and if this family can't treat him with the same warmth and generosity you extend to his cousins, then I need to know that clearly now, so I can make decisions accordingly about how much of our family's time we continue investing in gatherings where that's true. Susan's composure cracked slightly at that, real distress showing through her earlier defensiveness. Are you threatening to keep him away from us? I'm not threatening anything, I said, keeping my voice level. I'm telling you honestly what the actual stakes are here. Eli deserves grandparents who see him as fully, completely theirs, the same way his cousins are seen. If that's something you're genuinely willing to work toward, I want that for him, sincerely. But if this is a pattern that's simply going to continue, dressed up in politeness and unconscious distinctions, then I have to protect my son from slowly absorbing, over years, the message that he matters less than the other kids in this family. David sat with that for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost most of its earlier defensiveness. I think I need to actually sit with this, honestly. I don't want to just apologize quickly and go back to doing exactly what I've always done. I think you're describing something real that I've never let myself look at clearly, and I owe it to Eli, and to you both, to actually take that seriously instead of just smoothing it over today. I appreciated that response more than I expected to, genuinely. It was the first moment in that entire conversation where I felt like David was actually reckoning with the pattern rather than simply managing the discomfort of being confronted with it. Susan, unfortunately, didn't arrive at the same place quite as readily. I still think this is being blown a little out of proportion, she said, even as David sat beside her, visibly working through something more genuine. We love Eli. I don't think one hot dog undoes years of love. It's not about one hot dog, Susan, Marcus said, his patience clearly thinning. It's about years of small distinctions that add up to a pattern, and I need you to actually hear that, instead of continuing to minimize it every time it's brought up. I'm not trying to minimize anything, she stopped, visibly frustrated, working through something complicated in her own understanding of the situation. I don't know how to just suddenly see something I've never seen before, Marcus. I love that boy. I don't know what more you want me to say right now. I don't need you to have a perfect answer today, I said, gently, trying to open a door rather than close one entirely, even as some part of me understood that Susan's resistance was likely to be a longer, harder road than David's. I just need you to actually think about it honestly, over the coming weeks, instead of deciding right now that there's nothing here worth examining. We left that coffee shop conversation without full resolution, David more genuinely reflective, Susan still largely defensive, though visibly unsettled in a way that suggested the conversation had at least planted something she couldn't fully dismiss. Marcus and I talked through it extensively on the drive home, both of us uncertain about exactly how much would actually change as a result of that single conversation. I don't think we're going to get a clean, immediate transformation, Marcus said. I think my dad might genuinely work on this. I'm less sure about my mom. I think you're right, I said, which means we need to decide, together, what we're actually willing to accept going forward, regardless of how fully either of them changes. We spent the following 2 weeks watching carefully, not confronting anything further, but paying close attention to how David and Susan behaved in the smaller, more ordinary family interactions that happened in between the big, formal gatherings. David called Eli directly, twice during that period, just to check in. Something he'd rarely done before, always routing communication with Eli through Marcus rather than reaching out himself. Susan's behavior stayed largely the same, polite, warm on the surface, but without any visible sign that the coffee shop conversation had actually shifted anything underneath. 2 weeks after that Christmas dinner, almost to the day, Marcus and I sat down together and made a decision that would define our family's relationship with his parents going forward. We'd been quietly, consistently covering a significant portion of the costs for Marcus's parents' larger family gatherings for the past 2 years, not something either of us had ever mentioned openly, since it had started small and grown gradually, the way these arrangements sometimes do. David's fixed income after retirement had made hosting increasingly difficult for him, and Marcus, as the more financially stable of his two sons, had quietly stepped in, covering catering costs, contributing toward the holiday grocery bills, even helping fund that specific steak dinner that had, in the end, excluded his own son from the very meal he'd helped pay for. I want to be honest about the specific, sharp irony of that fact, because it mattered enormously to the decision we made 2 weeks later. Marcus had contributed nearly $400 toward that Christmas dinner, toward steaks his own son hadn't been served. I keep thinking about that, Marcus told me, the week after our coffee shop conversation, sitting at our kitchen table with the same quiet intensity he'd carried since the dinner itself. I helped pay for a meal that excluded my own kid. I don't think I can keep quietly funding gatherings that don't fully include him, not without at least being honest about what that funding actually represents. What do you want to do? I asked, though I think I already sensed, from his tone, where this was heading. I think we need to step back, he said slowly. Not from my parents entirely. I'm not ready to cut them off completely, especially with my dad seeming genuinely willing to work on this. But I think we need to stop quietly subsidizing gatherings where Eli isn't guaranteed to be treated the same as his cousins. I think that's the actual, concrete boundary underneath everything we said at that coffee shop. 2 weeks after Christmas, almost to the day, Marcus sent his parents a careful, honest message. Not confrontational, not dramatic, simply clear about a decision we'd made together as a family. Mom and Dad, I've been thinking a lot since our conversation 2 weeks ago, and I want to be transparent about something. I've been covering a significant portion of the costs for our family gatherings for the past 2 years, including a good part of this past Christmas dinner. Given everything we talked about regarding Eli, I don't think I can keep doing that without knowing, clearly, that he's genuinely included as fully as his cousins are, every time. So going forward, we're going to step back from hosting and contributing to larger gatherings the way we have been, unless we can be confident that's actually true. This isn't meant as punishment, it's just an honest boundary, given what we've all named clearly over these past 2 weeks. I love you both, and I hope, over time, we can rebuild towards something that includes everyone fully. But I'm not willing to keep quietly funding a version of this family that treats my son as less than. I remember reading that message over his shoulder, feeling something settle in my chest that was equal parts pride in Marcus and quiet grief for what this decision represented, a genuine, painful distancing from family relationships that had, until 2 weeks ago, felt mostly comfortable and uncomplicated, at least on the surface. David called within the hour, his voice carrying a rawness I hadn't heard from him before. I understand, he said, simply, once Marcus had explained the decision more fully over the phone, with me sitting close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. I don't think I fully understood how deep this went until right now, hearing it laid out this plainly. I want you to know I'm going to actually work on this, Marcus. Not just say I will. I want Eli to know, clearly, that he's my grandson, completely, the same as his cousins. I'd like the chance to show you that, over time, if you're willing to give me that chance. I am, Marcus said. I want that too, Dad. I just needed you to understand how serious this actually is. And I think stepping back financially was the clearest way I had to show you that. Susan didn't call that day, or the next. When she finally did, nearly a week later, her tone had shifted somewhat from the defensiveness of the coffee shop conversation, though I sensed it came more from genuine concern about the financial and relational consequences than from any deep, internal reckoning with the pattern itself. I don't want this family to fall apart over this, she said. I'll try to do better, Marcus. I promise. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something, because I still turn it over myself, more than a year past that Christmas dinner. How do you protect a child from a bias he's too young to fully understand, while also making sure the adults responsible for it actually reckon with what they've done? I think that balance, shielding Eli from the weight of it while refusing to let David and Susan minimize what had happened, was the hardest, most delicate part of this entire year, harder, in some ways, than the confrontation itself. I want to be honest about where things actually stand now, because I think stories like this deserve an honest ending rather than a uniformly triumphant one. David has genuinely changed, consistently, over the past year, calling Eli directly, remembering his interests, making a visible, sustained effort to close the gap that had existed for years without him fully seeing it. We've slowly resumed attending some family gatherings, cautiously, watching carefully each time to make sure the pattern doesn't quietly resurface. Susan's change has been slower, more uneven, genuine in some moments, defensive again in others, a work in progress rather than a completed transformation. I've made peace with that unevenness, understanding that some patterns, built over years, take longer to fully unlearn than others, and that Susan's road to actually seeing Eli clearly may simply be a longer one than David's turned out to be. I think one of the hardest things to name, in situations like this, is bias that never announces itself as cruelty. Nobody in David and Susan's position would have described their treatment of Eli as deliberate exclusion, and I believe, mostly, that they didn't experience it that way themselves. But intention and impact are different things, and I think it's important to say clearly, a 6-year-old doesn't experience a hot dog on his plate, while every cousin around him has steak, as an accident. He experiences it as a fact about his place in the family, whether or not any adult meant it that way. If you're watching this and recognizing a similar pattern in your own family, small, individually explainable distinctions that add up, over years, into something a child is quietly absorbing, I want to encourage you to trust that pattern rather than talking yourself out of it the way I did for 2 years before that steak dinner finally made it undeniable. I think the decision to step back financially, rather than simply having another emotional conversation, was the single clearest thing Marcus and I did in this entire process, and I want to name why. Emotional conversations can be minimized, reframed, gradually forgotten in the comfortable rhythm of ordinary family life. A concrete, financial boundary is harder to explain away. It forced David and Susan to reckon with the actual, tangible cost of the pattern they'd built, rather than simply absorbing an uncomfortable conversation and quietly returning to old habits once enough time had passed. I don't think financial boundaries are the right tool in every family situation, but I do think there's real value in pairing an emotional truth with a concrete consequence, when you're dealing with a pattern that's proven resistant to words alone. Eli doesn't fully understand what happened, and I've made a deliberate choice to keep it that way, at least for now. He knows, in an age-appropriate sense, that his grandparents are working on being better about some things, the way most families sometimes need to work on being kinder to each other. He doesn't know about the coffee shop conversation, or the financial boundary, or the specific weight of the hot dog sitting on his plate that Christmas. I think there will come a day, when he's older, where I tell him this story more fully, not to make him angry at his grandparents, but because I think he deserves, eventually, to understand how hard his parents fought to make sure he was never treated as less than, even in moments when he was too young to notice it happening himself. Eli is 7 now, thriving, closer to his grandfather than he's ever been, still building a slower, more cautious relationship with his grandmother. Marcus and I attend family gatherings again, selectively, watching carefully each time, ready to step back again if the pattern ever resurfaces in any form. I don't know if Susan will ever fully arrive at the place David has reached. I've made peace with that uncertainty, the way I've made peace with so much of this uneven, imperfect process. What I know clearly, now, in a way I didn't fully trust myself to know 2 years ago, is that my son's place in this family is not something I'm willing to quietly, indefinitely negotiate on his behalf. I said it clearly once, at a coffee shop table, and I meant every word of it, and I'll say it again, as many times as it takes, for as long as Eli needs me to. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to protect a child from a bias they were too young to fully see themselves? And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because sometimes the clearest boundary you can set isn't a speech. It's simply refusing to keep funding a version of family that doesn't fully include the people you love most.